Okay, so welcome everybody to the webinar 2 of Navigating the Unseen. We're going to do a case study today. We've only got limited details on it, but it's still a good learning exercise for us and everybody on the Victorian psychosocial matter. I'd just like to acknowledge that the lands we meet on today are the lands of the Kaurna people. All right, sorry we're a bit flustered, but we'll get there. Session outline, we're just going to talk about the case study, which is the Court Services Victoria matter. And we're going to look at the failures, the lessons learnt coming out of that. And then once we get Fiona in, she's going to do the section on applying the risk management framework to mitigate psychosocial hazards. Fiona was going to control the PowerPoint as well, so unfortunately I don't think you're going to be able to see that, but we'll certainly have that to you afterwards once we're done. All right, so the Court Services Victoria, they're an independent statutory body and they administer the Victoria's court system. So in October 2023, I'll call them the CSV moving forward. They were sentenced in the Magistrates Court in Melbourne after pleading guilty to one single charge of failing to provide and maintain a safe workplace between December 2015 and September 2018. So this is pre, certainly for South Australia, well pre psychosocial reg coming in. And what the CSV admitted to was that they failed to properly identify and assess risks in relation to psychosocial or psychological wellbeing of employees, and that contributed to a toxic workplace culture. And they admitted that that led to the suicide of a lawyer that worked at the CSV and stress leave for several other workers. So they had quite a few workers had work cover claims in and weren't at work because of this. So essentially what in this case, the CSV had a primary duty to ensure the health and safety of workers while they're at work in the business or undertaking. They failed to do it. So it's quite a basic sort of offence they were charged with. They were fined $379,157, so pretty well $380,000, and they had a cost order in the amount of over $13,000. So Magistrate Walsh was the matter that heard this matter, and he noted he would have imposed a fine of $700,000 had there not been a guilty plea. So the way the system works, if you offer a guilty plea, the judge has to apply a discount. So he would have given $700,000. He had to take into account the discounting regime because they pleaded very early and admitted the offence, and also though he was caught out with a jurisdictional limit of the Magistrates Court. So he actually couldn't. He didn't have the power to go that high in a fine in the Magistrates Court. So that's where we ended up with the 380. But that's actually quite a significant penalty if you look across the penalties handed out for work health safety matters. That's quite significant. What the magistrate did do, he noted that the offence of industrial manslaughter was not available to him because it hadn't been, it wasn't in effect then. But had it been available, he would have expected the prosecution at the time to, have a look at that and see whether they would run it as an industrial manslaughter. So yeah, he did demonstrate that it was quite a significant matter. So in this case, some of these workers never returned to the workplace, including the in-house lawyer, Miss Wilby, who unfortunately committed suicide after being diagnosed with a major depressive order stemming from work. So when we're looking at where this came from, and certainly like we've talked before around if someone dies from a duty breach, with the new industrial manslaughter offence, which comes in South Australia in 1 July, then there's obviously a couple more tests and there's a couple more options for regulators, and I'll go through those a little bit later. The court found that workers were exposed to traumatic material. So they, Miss Wilby's case, she was a prosecutor doing quite serious trial work. So that would probably look like on a day-to-day basis for some of these prosecutors, they would maybe do a murder trial and they would see hundreds and hundreds of photos of, a deceased person and injuries and all that sort of thing. She would have seen multiple variations of that through her work. And just from a vicarious trauma sort of perspective, she would have met lots of, upset, traumatized people and hearing all those sort of stories. She was also doing the duties of 2 or 3 solicitors at the time. So the DPP were, I keep saying DPP, the court services were quite lowly staffed. So she was doing the job of 2 or 3 solicitors at times, and all the workload that went with those matters that she was dealing with. And, they would obviously carry a quite high caseload anyway. She sought support from her employer, and that was accepted by CSV, but no actions were taken in relation to that. So collectively, the worker complaints included allegations of bullying, favouritism, cronyism, verbal abuse. There was derogatory comments in the office, intimidation between employees and management towards staff, invasion of privacy and perceived threats to future progression in that organisation. So if we look at the failures, CSV admitted that it failed to conduct any adequate processes to identify risks and any adequate risk assessment of the risks to psychological health at employees at the Coroner's Court. How this breach occurred under Victorian law is different than how it would look here. So Victoria is the only jurisdiction in Australia that's not implemented the WHS laws, and the offence charged by Victoria was akin to that of, from what I can see, a category 2 offence under work health safety here. So essentially what the CSV is admitted to is that it had a duty under WHS law, failed to comply with that duty, and they exposed a person or persons to risk of harm. So Miss Wilby and also, the other workers. It's a couple of people asked me how you get to an industrial, certainly an industrial manslaughter offence, but also how do you get to an offence that for a breach of psychosocial? And the simple answer is it's no different than any other breach. So in South Australia, we provide for 3 categories of criminal offences for breach of work health safety duty. So the maximum penalties are different depending on the category of the offence and whether the offender is an individual, obviously a worker or a person conducting business or undertaking, or an officer or a corporate body. So, and sorry for the people that would already be way across this, but a category 1 offence is made out with quite a high burden of proof. So, and that's the most serious offence under work health safety. So Cat 1 offence is made out when the prosecution proves the duty holder, without reasonable excuse, engages in conduct with gross negligence or is reckless as to the risk to an individual of death, serious injury or illness. So the hard part of that obviously is you've got to prove that the duty holder was grossly negligent or reckless. Cat 2 offence, a duty holder fails to comply with a health safety duty that exposes a person to a risk of death or serious illness. This is obviously an easier test, and the facts of this case likely sit, in my mind, with a Cat 2, albeit it's different legislation that's under the Health Safety Act in Victoria. And a Cat 3 offence, a duty holder fails to comply with a health and safety duty, and that's all they need. All they need to do is prove that they've failed to comply with the health and safety duty. So the holder of the duty had a duty, and they breach that duty. It's as simple as that. So really basic elements, and that would certainly also be something that would, from these circumstances, we would get up on a Cat 3. As of 1 July this year, as soon as you get a workplace death, so in the case of Miss Wilby committing suicide, additional consideration will be given automatically in South Australia to industrial manslaughter. And, we would look at whether it fit the criteria for that, and following the prosecution guidelines, whether we should prosecute. So just a bit of a recap from last time. A person commits the offence of industrial manslaughter if a person has a health and safety duty, person engages in conduct that breaches that duty. So we're still sitting in the normal events that would fit with the normal categories of offences. And then we move into that conduct causes the death of an individual to whom the duty is known. And then the last step, industrial manslaughter, is the person engages in conduct with gross negligence or is reckless as to the risk to an individual of death or serious injury or illness. So the industrial manslaughter is similar to that of a Cat 1. So conduct, and the conduct for the purpose of that section, that industrial manslaughter, is just simply that the person has died. So you're really sort of, to my mind, you're running a Cat 1 sort of offence and burden of proof, and the person's died. So that's when we start to look at it. I'm just going to stop for a quick second. I'm just going to see if I can see Fiona in here. So if you just bear with me, I'm just going to try and grab someone else in here. Bridget, have I got you in the webinar? I can see you. I just don't know if you're connected. All right, apologies everybody again. I'll keep going in the hope that they're working in the background to get in. Okay, so the lessons learned from this case is they're fairly simple actually. So employers must take precautions to control the known risks to health and safety. We all know that, including known risks and risks that arise from the nature of the work being undertaken by the employees. And although, sorry. All right, maybe I'll just go through. I'm just trying to think, if I don't get Fiona in, we're going to miss little bits of it. So look, I'll go through how we do this. So the things that we would look at as a regulator, I guess, is is there a positive workplace culture in the organisation, and that's sort of an indication of whether we've got other things sitting under that. We'd look at whether the employer consults with employees when assessing and identifying any risks. Are there policies and procedures for reporting and responding to psychosocial hazards? Is the employer regularly asking employees how they are, encouraging open and social discussion? Are there systems in place for workforce planning, workforce management, workload management, and just the skills of the leaders? So, has the employer sought to develop skills for leaders through coaching, mentoring, training, to improve the support to the employees that they manage? Do they seek to act on feedback from employees during the organisational change processes? And do they inform workers about their entitlements if they become unwell or unfit for work? So, when people are struggling, are the employees being proactive in making sure that they have they can access their entitlements and they can have the time off they need, or are they just trying to push them back into working because they're short-staffed? And probably really importantly, and this certainly has to be done well, does the employer provide appropriate and confidential channels to support workplace and mental health well-being? Do they have an employee assistance program, and is that implemented well? So I guess although this has been a long time coming, it's fair to say that up until quite recently, psychological health and safety did not receive the same focus in workplaces as physical health and safety. And I know here that we've had these matters come up pre-psychosocial reg, and it's always been quite difficult to fit them in one of the cat, certainly in the Cat 1. But there's the normal breach category 1, 2, 3 offences. And look, and I think this is quite surprising. Everyone's sort of, I hear people saying that, this is a new thing, and it came on really quickly, but it actually didn't. I guess if you look historically, I've been at SafeWork since 2019. The first thing that I saw when I got here was the Boland Review that happened in 2018. And that was already, deeply involved in these sort of issues, and recommending that we make changes to ensure people's psychological safety at work was protected. And then you've got, another significant report, probably the 2020 report by the Productivity Commission on Mental Health. So, that report reported on the increasing economic, social, and individual costs of workplace psychiatric injury in Australia. There's many other reports. There's return to work reports in South Australia, but all across the other compensation regulators, the workplace the workers' compensation regulators. That this is a growing issue for them, and it's really pushing out the amount of money they're spending in those schemes. And I guess we can all agree that it's a good thing that there is growing awareness of the significance of psychosocial hazards and injuries in the workplace. And more importantly, I think it's great that all jurisdictions have banded together on this, and we've come up with a common approach to the management of psychosocial hazards with the new regulations. And even the implementation of the model code, albeit some jurisdictions change them around a little bit. We're all trying to have the same sort of approach. We're just trying to also take account for different needs of different jurisdictions. I'm just going to stop again really briefly and just see if I can get anyone else in. So I'm just going to, sorry, just bear with me. I'm just going to try and email someone and see if they can give you the slides, because I can't even see whether you've got the slides. Okay, I've just got someone. I'm just going to try and if everyone keeps bearing with me, I'm just going to try and look at what feedback I'm getting through the. I've just had Michaela ask, what's the method to identify a positive culture in a workplace from a legal perspective? I guess the answer to that is we don't look at. I guess that's the sort of thing that our inspectors would go out and have a look at the culture of the workplace. But we would probably look at the things that we're missing. So we wouldn't start ticking off and say, okay, they're doing well because they've got these things. We would go through a list of things that we would actually focus on the things they didn't have and the improvements we could make. So. So I guess, but from what Michaela's questions asked, I guess what employers must look for and what we would look for when we're asking them questions is you would expect your employers to look for warning signs in staff. So if we had an incident and so if we had a complaint made and we went out and we started speaking to these staff, we would look at whether it was obviously employees that there was warning signs, there was changes in behaviour maybe of staff. We'd look at absences potentially. So were there unexpected absences and or were employees underperforming or overworking? So we'd look at maybe the hours they were working. And I'm sort of trying to link this back to Ms. Wilby. So, she would have had changes. She had changes in behaviours. So there was warning signs there. She was complaining about and raising concerns. And she was certainly overworking. They knew she was overworking and did nothing to address that. So we would also look at whether employees who raise genuine concerns, and this is all about culture. So a good culture and I guess a caring culture within a department or an agency or a business would have a system where employees could raise genuine concerns of overwork, and we would look at whether those concerns were being treated seriously and more importantly addressed by the employer. For example, employers ensuring they employ enough staff, have shared workload or reallocating potential where possible, and just making sure that the load is evenly spread, so you don't have someone like Miss Wilby who's working. Well, I think I've got someone here.
Hi, Andrew.
Oh, thank you. What a stressful
Hi, Andrew.
time. Hello.
It was very stressful, yes. Hello, everyone, and apologies for the technical issues this morning. Now, Andrew, can you actually see me?
I can see you.
You can see me. Fantastic. Can you see the slides?
Yep, I can finally see my slides. I don't have to just keep thinking what it's all about. All right. If we can jump to maybe lessons learned. I'm sort of struggling through that.
Sure.
And thank you everyone for being patient with me. Okay. It's been a valuable lesson for me as well that we need to test and have some paper documents on one side. So I guess like other things employers must do is we'd expect when we're going out looking at them, do they have training to assist managers identify red flags? So like I certainly know as a manager here at SafeWork, we do. We have quite an extensive management training program around what to look for with our staff, and then also training on how and when we should respond to signs of concerns, including doing welfare checks, referring employees for optional work-related screening. So we have inspectors here who obviously are in that space of being subject to vicarious trauma through their workplace and in seeing accidents. I've got someone on my own team that I monitor quite closely who's my freedom of information officer. So she will look at case files and she has all those photos. So we've got all things in place where where it's not necessary she doesn't do those sort of things. And just making sure that people are we have the right people in the right role. So if you find that someone's not in the right role, well then we look at moving that person into another role. and making sure that they're not subjected to these things. So I guess the other lessons learned are employees need to recognise an employee's commitment to their work and communicate they're valued, both as individuals and team members. So, you know, it's a pretty basic thing. We hear it all the time that communicating your appreciation to staff goes a long way, and it's certainly a great motivator. So managers and leaders also need to understand they must take a proactive mental health approach to mental health at work, not only in light of these changes, but also because of the workers' comp side of it, the economic, social and individual flow and effects for work for employees. I guess as a manager, we would look at, or if we went out, we would look at, do employees have an open door approach? So employees can raise concerns about workloads, focusing on what's happening at CSV here. So workloads, poor workplace culture. So they've got the bullying, they've got harassment, they've got all sorts of other stuff sort of going on. So do they have an approach for employees to say, hey, look, I don't like the way people speak to me, you know, in the workplace. I don't feel like the way I'm being harassed because I'm not keeping up with others, or there's a workload and everyone's stressed and giving me a hard time. So whether you've got that there and adequate support, and also, even if they do have an open door approach, what happens with that information? So does management then distill that information and take some positive follow-up actions, or do they just go, oh, okay, well, this isn't good, I'll just see how it goes? And I guess, like, just from the perspective of SafeWork, and also certainly with the CSV, police have the same sort of thing, AMBOs have the same sort of thing, whether they have occupational screening, and probably I dare say prisons do have occupational screening, so that is required, and the mental health and risks and conditions in individuals are identified, and systems are put in place to respond to those accordingly. And just, I guess, from just going from the question I had before, it's really important that people act on those known risks as well. So you know, businesses that do occupational screening, so they know all these things, really they've just sort of handed themselves to a platter if they don't act on these risks, because it's really building a case for negligence by an employer if they've got all that information and then they actually don't do anything with it. I'm going to hand over to Fiona now, and she'll talk about common psychosocial hazards.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for summarising the case in such detail. I suppose that, like, the insight from the regulator perspective is always so insightful, and prosecution process is really like comparable to that of a criminal investigation in order to be able to lay charges and successfully gain a conviction. It is very sad that it took such extreme consequences of someone taking their own life or something to be done in this case. But I suppose a precedent has been set, and it's comforting to know that the system's working and organisations will be accountable for protecting the mental health of their workers.
Yeah. Actually, Fiona, if I could just say as well, this isn't uncommon. So, you know, we've picked this one because it's, you know, through our fatality data that we get in each year, and there's more of a link now to workplaces, and there's a bit more evidence there now. But suicide is not an unusual thing, and it's certainly not an unusual thing in people who are employed in those places where they're subject to lots of vicarious trauma, and there's no avenues for them to seek assistance and coping mechanisms.
Yeah. Now, actually, before I jump to the next slide, I'm just conscious we've missed kind of the some of the upfront slides. So I just want to take everybody back to this screen that we have here. So, for those of you who joined us in the last webinar, you'll be familiar with this, but just due to the short time frame that we have and the number of people online with us, we did set up a Slido. We have set up a Slido to capture all of your questions. So you can actually either scan in with your phone via the QR code we have on screen, or follow that web link and enter the details to access the Slido. And you'll be able to ask your questions and vote for a question that you've seen someone else ask here as well. And then at the end of the webinar, Andrew and I will try and get through as many questions as we can, starting from the top voted questions and working our way down. Now, again, apologies for the technical issues this morning. It does probably mean that we have a little bit less time for questions later in the webinar today, but we'll try and get through as many as we can and be as concise as possible as well. There will be very soon, I'll also be pointing you to the poll section when you log into Slido as well. So at the top, on the top left-hand side, you'll see the Q&A, and on the right-hand side, you'll see polls. So when I activate the poll and ask, kind of do some audience engagement, then please click over to that as well. Okay, so I suppose just, you know, hearing what Andrew was talking about in the case there were clearly a lot of complexities in the case. And the psychosocial hazards weren't always really apparent, or they're always compounding each other. So just after hearing about the case, I've set up a poll on Slido for you to consider which of the common psychosocial hazards you think might have been prevalent in this case. So I will just activate that now. So some of you will click into now. Now, some of you might be familiar with this slide. We showed this in the last webinar as well. So this is a list of common psychosocial hazards from the model code, and the hazards in the darker blue boxes highlight hazards which are likely to cause harm due to their presence or there being too much of in the workplace, and the light blue boxes indicate hazards which are likely to cause harm due to their absence or there being too little of in the workplace. So have a look through that list, and after hearing that case about Andrew, just this isn't a test, it's just kind of to get a gauge of what you thought, what hazards you thought were present. Go to the live results as they're coming up. Yeah, so lots of people picking high job demands, traumatic events, material, and poor support and resources. Well, all of you have clearly been listening. Those were definitely three of the top, I suppose, key hazards that were present as well. There was probably elements of poor interpersonal conflict and relationships in the workplace, and of course the poor organisational justice, which was around the favouritism as well. High job demands in that the workers were required to undertake the duties of multiple roles. Traumatic events or materials, so the vicarious trauma and the type of work the workers were engaged to do without assistance and support. And of course the lack of support and resources from management to assist as well. Yeah, and the bullying, harassment. Excellent. So people are pretty bang on there. I mean, in this case, the risk management process failed and the controls weren't effective. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the risk assessment process or risk management process, I've got a diagram here in the slides just to help you visualize the different components. Now, as an organization, you can identify psychosocial hazards, guys, it's just a bit of a tongue twister, and manage their risks in the same way that you manage physical hazards. So you firstly identify the hazards, then you assess the risks, then you implement control measures, and you also monitor and review. And this is a continuous cycle because the type of work, the work environment, your workers, it will continually change and evolve, and therefore so will your hazards and your risks. And consultation, which is that, that wraparound, all of those steps, it's actually a key element of providing a healthy and safe work environment. So you have a duty to consult with affected workers about work health and safety matters. And if they have a health and safety rep, then they must be included in the consultation as well. And this is a duty that is specifically described in the legislation. Now I'm going to break down each of these elements to help you understand about what each of the steps actually involve. So we'll go to the first step, which is around hazard identification. So the first step is to identify all work-related psychosocial hazards. And this involves finding things and situations that could potentially harm workers and others at the workplace. And there are a number of ways that you can identify psychosocial hazards. I think the most obvious one, but strangely enough, is one that organisations don't do well, is simply talking to your workers about what psychosocial hazards are and whether they think they experience them. You can also use anonymous employee surveys like culture, engagement, well-being surveys, or pulse checks to gather information. You can observe work behaviours, such as if workers are rushed, how workers interact with each other, the mood of the organisation. Even noticing things like maybe people eating frequently at their desks may be a sign that there's something going on. You can research what types of hazards can be present based on the industry that you work in and the people that your workers interact with on a regular basis. And you can also review any data you might have, like sick leave patterns, records of injuries and illnesses, workers' comp claims, safety inspections, grievances, complaints, internal investigations and processes, exit interviews, usage trends from your employee assistance program, turnover rates. Like, so much data. You might not even realize how data rich your workplace is. And if looking in the right places, it can tell you so much about not only the current health, but possibly even the projected health of your organisation as well. I'm not sure today whether we have enough time to go into lead and lag indicators specifically, but lag indicators are reactive measures that give information about the effectiveness of controls after an unwanted incident or psychological injury has occurred. And lead indicators are proactive and predictive measures that measure events leading up to a psychological injury and reveal potential problems in your health and safety programs. But this topic in itself might actually be something for a future webinar. Assessing the risk, so step 2. Assessing their risk involves considering what could happen if somebody is exposed to a psychosocial hazard, the degree of harm that might result, and the likelihood of that outcome. So when assessing risks, you need to think about 3 things. So duration, which is how long workers might be exposed to the hazard. Frequency, how often they're exposed to that hazard. And then severity as well. So how severe the psychosocial risks are and their outcomes when exposed. And the psychosocial risks are increased when exposures are more severe, such as exposure to a traumatic incident, more frequent, such as regularly performing tasks without adequate support, or longer in duration, such as high job demands over weeks or months, or for some people even years. And psychosocial risks also increase when there is more than one identified or present at any one time in the workplace. And you can use a risk assessment template to assess your psychosocial risks, or there are surveys and psychosocial risk assessment tools available. And I've popped a link of the psychosocial risk template into the resources section of the slides as well, so you'll have access to that if you're not familiar with it. And the
Fiona,
third step. Yes.
Can I jump in? Just that psychosocial risk tool that's on the SafeWork website, we use that as a screening here. So I really encourage everyone to have a look at that. So that's when someone reports in a psychosocial matter, we screen through that so that it basically collects all the evidence that we require in one go to start on a really solid base.
Yeah, it's a really robust. It's a template that really, I think, makes you think robustly about the hazards and how you're managing them. And then controlling the risks. So under the work health and safety laws, risks to health and safety must be managed following the hierarchy of controls. And this applies for physical and psychosocial hazards. Now, as an organisation, you must always aim to firstly eliminate the hazard first. Where a hazard can't be eliminated, as there might be some roles where there just are inherent risks associated with the role. For example, police officers dealing with violence and aggression, or social workers exposed to vicarious trauma. Then you must minimise so far as reasonably practicable using control measures. So only after have you applied substitution, isolation and engineering control measures to minimise risks should you use administrative controls. Now, when you consider this hierarchy in terms of control for physical hazards, it probably makes a lot more sense. Probably makes a little bit less sense when you apply it in its current form to psychosocial hazards though. I really did try to think about what personal protective equipment could be used to control a psychosocial hazard. And the only one I could think of was earplugs to maybe help ignore people. So I'm going to show you a different version of the hierarchy of control that I think makes a bit more sense for psychosocial hazards, but still underpinned by the same principles. So at the top of the hierarchy, it's still to eliminate the hazard where possible. So eliminating toxic behaviours and unhealthy work conditions. Then we move down to job redesign, which can involve rearranging people and teams to suit their strengths, maybe reviewing delegations to improve job control and autonomy. And then we have adjust. Adjust would involve making changes to existing practices and policies and potentially substituting tasks with safer alternatives. And then we have educating. So educating is about ensuring staff are trained and understand what psychosocial hazards are and what to do in the event of exposure to a psychosocial hazard. And this could include, clearer policies and guidelines and training for staff and managers. And then we have encourage, which is about supporting staff to engage with the controls or initiatives designed to mitigate risk, or disclosing their concerns and seeking support when needed. Now, when you do an assessment of what controls you have in the workplace to mitigate psychosocial hazards, it's likely that you'll find most of your controls are ones to control the damage, so after there has been exposure to the hazard. And these mostly sit at adjust, educate, and encourage. At the top of the hierarchy, eliminate and redesign, these two levels of controls are generally aimed at preventing the hazard from occurring in the first place. And in the workplace, you really need to have a balance of preventative controls as well as support controls. And then again, there might be times where there are hazards present which are just inherent to the role and cannot be prevented. But as an organisation, if questioned or investigated, you really need to be able to demonstrate that you went as far as reasonably practicable and there were no other controls higher up in the hierarchy that you could have implemented to prevent harm to your workers. I'm just going to go through some examples as well. I won't have time to go through every single psychosocial hazard in the list, but I have picked the 3 psychosocial hazards, the 3 key ones based on the case study we've discussed today, just to provide you with examples of what controls might look like against the hierarchy. Now, I can't possibly cover every single control for every single type of role or situation, so this is just some examples and some food for thought. So starting with vicarious trauma at the very base level of control, so at encourage. You're possibly encouraging staff to undertake self-assessments, self-disclose to their manager or internal support networks that they're not doing okay, and to proactively seek support and access counselling services or the Employee Assistance Program, so EAP provider, if you offer one through your workplace, and maybe to engage in coping strategies that work for them. Then moving up to educate, you may be providing awareness training to staff and managers about what vicarious trauma is and what it looks like and feels like. Upskilling managers in how to identify systems and support staff. You might be offering peer support networks or clinical supervision to staff exposed to vicarious trauma or undertaking regular wellbeing checks. You may also be ensuring a robust induction and onboarding program so people are aware of the material that they may be exposed to and where to seek help, and have the relevant skills and training from commencement of their new role. And then again, at a step higher at adjust, some examples include modifying the way people are exposed to traumatic material. So potentially things like desensitization strategies. So an example of desensitization is if we're looking at prosecutors, for example, looking at evidence, instead of watching video and CCTV footage as their introduction to their case, they might want to expose themselves and their knowledge about the case by reading it first, maybe looking at photos in black and white, or watching the video in black and white without sound, and then kind of working their way up to watching the video in full color and sound to reduce that initial shock and trauma. An example might also be working with individuals to adjust their disclosure and support strategies based on their own personal differences and needs as well. And at redesign, examples might include changing the way people work or how distributing work is done with the aim of reducing length of exposure. So again, this could be potentially assessing trauma load of cases, providing or buffering kind of low trauma work in between high trauma work, so that it's not all, child offence cases, for example, in a row. You might want to buffer that with something like lower level theft or larceny, again, in the example of a prosecutor. And then at the very top, at eliminate. And again, this may not always be possible. We'll give an example, though, of this is an example of admin staff working in forensic science. So a past practice was that they would review the file so they knew where it had to go, and this included potentially reading the contents of the file and seeing potentially distressing photo evidence and content. Now, identifying that these individuals didn't actually have to be exposed to the content, and by merely putting photos into envelopes and putting key notes on a cover page or on the top of the file itself would actually eliminate the need for admin staff to be exposed, or at least just roughly know what to expect before even opening the file. So having little tabs kind of on there to say this might be a child-related case, or this might be severe I don't know, something quite shocking to see. Somebody might pick that up and go, look, I can't, this is a real trigger for me, and maybe ask a colleague to actually deal with that file instead. So there are some things that you can actually put in place to limit your exposure on a need-to-know basis and actually remove people who don't necessarily need to be exposed. So that's just an example of eliminate for vicarious trauma. So moving on to high job demands. So again, starting at encourage. Some examples might include encouraging people to self-disclose and seek support if their workload is unmanageable, or to seek training or upskilling if that's what's required. Encouraging delegating of tasks and switching off times. And educate might also be about training, how to delegate effectively, how to use technology to minimize disruptions, expectations about work hours, flexi time, leave accrual, to be covered in induction and reinforced during performance conversations. At adjust, it might be about setting rules and around email etiquette, flexible work options, adjusting resourcing to meet demands. And there's actually a really great example of this as a control where the ATO was actually recently recognised for, where they introduced a no meeting times, where everyone in the organisation at the same time was given a chunk of focus time on a, I can't remember whether it was a weekly or a daily basis, but it's a chunk of focus time to do non-collaborative work. So no meetings, no phone calls, no disruptions. And that was with the aim so that people could really get into flow and concentrate on some thinking tasks or work that really required concentration. Some example of controls at redesign, again, this is aiming to kind of prevent the hazard in the first place, could be reviewing and restructuring roles to suit people's strengths, attracting and recruiting people with a strong fit to the role, understanding their expectations, leveraging artificial intelligence to reduce workload and complement human elements. And at the top of the chain, at eliminate, it might be workforce planning to ensure that you're pre-planning and anticipating what lies ahead, and to plan for the resources and skills that you might need to prevent talent shortage and prevent overloading people with additional responsibilities because you're not able to attract the people and the talent and the resources you actually need to deliver on demands. Now, moving on to poor management support. So again, controls at the base level might include encouraging open conversations and support-seeking behaviour. Controls that educate might include management or leadership training for managers, coaching, having roles available outside of management to provide support, for example, contact support officers or a wellbeing team, and clear guidelines on how to access support avenues and escalate their concerns as well. So maybe like escalation guidelines or procedures. Adjust might be changing how managers use different check-in methodologies to be proactive with their check-ins with staff and how they review the health of their teams. So potentially leveraging technology could be an option, or changing how you recruit and select people with leadership traits to fit your desired culture. And then at redesign, we might have controls that include attracting, recruiting, strategies, developing the right person fit for people management roles. So people with the skills and the heart to work with people, and not necessarily people who are just technically brilliant. So there are lots of times that I certainly see in organizations where people who are the best technical person are promoted to be the manager role. But, you know, at redesign, we're really looking at how are we actually attracting and developing and finding the right people for people manager roles and not just technical brilliance. So setting clear roles and responsibilities and expectations of what it actually means to lead and manage people. And then eliminate controls might be undertaking succession planning to ensure potential successors are identified and trained before stepping into leadership roles. Now, again, these are just some examples using the hierarchy of control, and some of these might even overlap in the hierarchy at times as well. So it might not always be clear-cut where it sits. And I suspect some of these controls will be directly relevant to some of you, and for others, hopefully it really just inspires some food for thought and how it might actually apply in your context. So moving on to monitor and review. As an organisation, you have to maintain, monitor and review, and if necessary, revise control measures to make sure that they actually remain effective. Now, what are some triggers when a review might occur is when a new hazard or a risk is identified, if a control measure is not adequately minimizing the risk, before a significant workplace change occurs, like change to the work environment or the systems of work that you use, where consultation indicates a review is necessary, and if a HSR, so a health and safety rep, requests a review. Now, consultation with your workers and their reps are required through the risk management cycle, and this includes when you're reviewing control measures as well. Now, I want to say this is the last step, but it's actually not, as the risk management process is cyclical. So there is no end as such, in that going through the risk management process, even if you've done it well and really thoroughly that first time around, it's not a box you've ticked and it's kind of put aside. For it to remain relevant and effective, you have to keep going back to step 1, to step 2, to step 3, and so forth. Which brings me perfectly into the next slide about common failures. So managing psychosocial hazards isn't a tick box activity that you do once. Your people, the type of work and how you expect your staff to do the work, and the environment is constantly changing and constantly evolving, and so should your risk management plan. Another common failure is not engaging in consultation. So proposing your course of action to staff and giving them 2 weeks to provide feedback and then kicking off the plan after the 2 weeks isn't really genuine consultation. All right, genuine consultation involves seeking input from your staff at all points of the process and actually listening to their experiences and taking on board their ideas to mitigate the risk. So actually engaging them in the problem solving and allowing them to contribute to the potential solutions. Sharing a predetermined plan with staff to look like you've afforded them the time to consider the proposal isn't consultation. Now, another common failure is when blame is placed on an individual as the cause of a problem, when actually the behaviour is likely to be a symptom of broader systemic issues. So, for example, when we take the hazard of, interpersonal conflict, sometimes it's really easy to just label a particular person as difficult or challenging, when really it's usually a lot deeper than that. Something in the workplace is likely causing that person to behave and react that certain way. They're likely to be operating under, under threat, and that's why people might look difficult or seem challenging, but there might actually be a lot going on for that person, and you really need to explore that a little bit more deeply. The last common another common failure, classic one, is simply not following the hierarchy of controls and relying heavily on lower level controls like training and encouraging people to seek counselling and talk to their EAP. And then the last common failure I'll talk about is the paper-based system. So it's not uncommon that I see that organisations focus really heavily on the compliance side, ensuring that they have the paperwork lined up in case the auditors come knocking. So the paperwork and documents might all be there to show that there is a system and controls to prevent harm. But if people don't know about it, or people don't know how to access it, don't know how to use it, or it's actually irrelevant to support them, then you still essentially don't have an effective system of controls. So remember not to lose sight of the purpose of what the existence of your health and safety system is there for. So it's to protect the people and not to pass an audit. Now, all of this, we've gone through a lot of information today. Now, all of this isn't a simple process, and you do need to draw upon expertise within your organisation to support you undertaking the risk management process. Now, if you don't have external expertise, then you might need to consider buying in the resources to support you to make sure you're protecting the health and safety of your workers from any workplace harm. Okay, so conscious that I've kind of made up for the time that I'm not here and I've just talked a lot and went on a mini rant. So before we move to the resources slide, Andrew, was there anything else you'd like to add?
Probably just going back to the table you did before, just from a regulator's perspective, I guess, the really big ones we get, so the most common issues that are raised with us are the basic ones. The workload sort of ones come up quite frequently, and they're quite often a source of pressure, stress and distress for employees, so they raise those issues with us. And when we're talking about workload, we just have to be careful that we're all talking about the same thing. So we're looking at the total volume of tasks that are required to be completed in a defined time frame, and how that fits with your role and function. So and there's different expectations across different industries. So I was just sort of reflecting when Fiona was talking. I worked in Canberra as a lawyer for the Australian Government Solicitor, and they were really good. They had you had to do 5 billable hours a day, so which doesn't sound like a lot, but by the time you do your admin and all those sort of things that you can't bill, you're up to about you're probably up to about 8 hours. So I was doing an easy 8 hours for them. And then when I left them, I went and worked for a private firm, and the billable hours were a minimum of 7 billable hours a day. So by the time you add your admin and your client relationship stuff, you're already up to 10 hours. So I was easily working 10 hours a day for those. And that's just on a normal day. So it's about having processes, certainly thinking back to Ms. Wilby and the CVS. It's about what employers can control is how those employees are supported. So they definitely could have controlled how she was supported. And the bullying harassment that came out in that case, where employees were speaking up. So she spoke up. She was doing the work of 2 to 3 lawyers, and just working obsessive, unreasonable sort of hours. As other employees were sort of going, hang on, we're working all these hours and we want to raise those concerns, there was a misunderstanding and a culture in that organisation that was an aversion to hard work. So they're going, oh, but this lawyer's doing all this work and I'm not working as much as them. And then they're getting harassed by the other employees who are upset they're doing more work and they don't like the fact that someone else is complaining and maybe they'll get some of their work. So I guess it's important for workload that we're talking about workload that's relentless in nature. So even on my team, I have a senior government relations officer who does all my ledge stuff. And we're doing lots of stuff for the government at the moment for election commitments and just progressing legislation. So she has really high workloads at times that I monitor and assist her with. But the volume the nature of the workload isn't relentless. It'll stop. So we constantly look at, okay, we can wear this, we'll put arrangements in place, we'll support you. It's only going to go for this period, but you can't expect them to keep going over and over and over. And I guess the other one that we get a lot of is bullying, harassment as well. So, and that's far more complex because of a lot of the bullying, harassment, just from my perspective, come out of these other issues. So we might have a workload issue, and then they start to become vulnerable employees because they're being treated unfairly, they're not being supported, and then they're having those issues where other employees are giving them a hard time because they're just not handling it as well. So yeah, maybe. And I've had a couple of questions on the teams. That's why I mentioned the bullying and harassment, but maybe that's something we need to look at in quite a bit of detail later.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. Now, again, I'm just conscious of time, and we've got a lot of questions coming through as well. So moving on to the resources. There is a model code of practice on how to manage psychosocial hazards at work. Now, SafeWork is working hard at creating the SA code as well. So, Andrew, is there any update that you can provide us about that one at all?
We're hoping to have, we've got to put it through the advisory committee and the minister. So we're hoping that we'll have that drafted by the end of March. There is a really convoluted process in South Australia to get it as an approved code of practice in South Australia, but we're quite committed to that, and we do have a strategy to try and get it through quickly. So look, if it's not our decision, obviously, whether it becomes an approved code of practice, it's certainly the minister and other parties, but he's very keen for us to give him a code of practice to look at. So maybe by June we'll all be settled.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Andrew. You can also, so as I mentioned before, the psychosocial risk assessment template from SafeWork SA website. So I've, as well as a whole bunch of other resources, I've popped that on this slide as well. And there are lots of other SafeWork jurisdictions like New South Wales and Queensland. They also have a number of resources that have been developed, which might be useful to look through as well. Of course, you can feel free to, connect in with SafeWork SA, and of course, feel free to send me an email as well. Connect with me on LinkedIn. Always happy to meet good people and work with like-minded people as well. Not nearly as scary in person either. Hopefully, Andrew can attest to that. I've also put up a couple of links for those who want to read a bit more into the case study as well. So I've got a link to the Court Services Victoria's response to the conviction and what they now have in place as a result to mitigate harm to their workers. So for those of you who want to read a little bit more into it, I've popped those links into there as well. So the web series. So, again, apologies for all the technical difficulties this morning. But hopefully you have found today's webinar valuable and good use of your time. As with the last session, we have set up a poll to collect your feedback about today and provide suggestions on future topics that would be of value to you. And Andrew and I will review the responses after the webinar today to take your lead on what you'd like to know more about for April's webinar. Now, at this stage, we've got Thursday, 14th of April locked in for the next one. So it's at the same time, 10 a.m. And we've been changing up the days of the week. We run the webinars in recognition that, some people are part-time and might miss out if we pick the same day of the week every time. Again, so the webinar is recorded, and we will send out the link to the video when we advertise the next webinar. And post-April, we will review the series to decide whether it's a platform that is accessible and valuable. So it will really be important for you to provide feedback, as it will determine whether or not we continue with the series. Okay, so I'm now going to jump into questions. I'll just click, I'll actually just stop that one and play that one. Cool, alrighty. So we'll show Q&A. Yes?
We had a question pop up just in the Teams that I saw previously.
In the Teams chat?
To it within Teams. And it was just around training. So it said, what's expected around training? Is that internal training or is that external training? And the answer effectively is that it doesn't matter as long as the training is well thought out and targeted and genuine. So I know at SafeWork we do a lot of in-house training because we feel that we can do that better than we can get it from an outside provider. We probably spend, I know we spend more money on doing internal training. So it just depends on the quality of the training and the genuineness of it, I think, more than anything.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I will just, that's done. So is there a legal definition of toxic culture or clarity about what this means? Or is it a catch-all terms reflecting presence of psychosocial hazards? So Andrew, is there a legal definition of toxic culture?
There's not a legal definition of toxic culture. I guess it's a descriptive term. It's like bullying, really, isn't it? So you use the term bullying, use the term toxic culture, and then you have the elements that would sit under that people commonly describe as. And we certainly wouldn't go and just to give an example, we wouldn't go for a prosecution. We'd say, they have breached the Work Health Safety Act because they've got a toxic culture or they're bullying. We would go in with the elements of that thing. So we'd say, for a bullying, we would say this happened to this employee on this day. They were, someone shouted at them this day. Their manager did these things. So that's the elements of it. So yeah, no definition of such. It's just the accumulation of things that are going wrong from a psychosocial perspective, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think it's just really a descriptive term that's used, but really it's about a culture that is not conducive to people's well-being, and it's causing harm.
Yeah.
Okay, on to the next question. Will the psychosocial hierarchy of controls become a published guideline for organisations to follow? Look, just again to be really clear, so the psychosocial hazard hierarchy of control, it's something that I suppose I've kind of put together as a way of assisting organisations think through controls for psychosocial hazards. At this point in time, the original hierarchy of control is still the one that's legally documented. But I suspect that as we understand psychosocial hazards more and as it evolves, that something might actually come out to support businesses and organisations better understand what level of controls are required when we're looking at the hierarchy. Would you say that's kind of safe to say as well, Andrew?
Yeah, and I think, look, the hierarchy of controls is just how the legislation sets out that you need to do it, and it's very effective. You look at, start off with elimination. That's always where your starting point is. But then you move down, and different hazards, whether they're physical or psychological, respond better in certain stages of that triangle. So probably a really good example is, I'm doing a bit of work on silicosis and engineered stone at the moment. Absolutely, you go through all the steps. The one that will save you when it comes to silicosis is PPE. So it's right at the bottom. That is the most effective measure for that particular incident. So yeah, you just work through it, and it's really good. It's more of a good thinking process because you sort of think outside of the box as you're going down the triangle.
Yeah, and I suppose it's ultimately about hand on heart saying, are you sure you couldn't have done more?
Yeah.
Yeah, to prevent root cause and not actually put a band-aid over it. Okay, so that's that one. If you know the role has potential psychosocial hazards, do you need to include that in the JNP or job advert? Look, I don't know that you need to include that in the JNP and advert. I think under a lot of JNPs that I've seen, there might be there's usually a heading something like the challenges in the role, and that's where you might see something like working with traumatic material or content, but certainly as part of the criteria when you're assessing somebody's suitability for the role, then you'd want to be looking at what kind of traits somebody might have that means that they're a better fit for the role. But I wouldn't say you'd necessarily need to have it. I think certainly when you're having somebody start with you as part of their induction, even during the interview process, you're being upfront with what the role actually includes. so that people can actually knowingly opt into the role and it not be a shock to them when, you know, on day one you're inducting them and you're saying you actually need to do all of these things that a person's actually uncomfortable with. So being upfront where you can is ideal, but you don't necessarily want to scare people away either without having the opportunity to fully explain to them what hazards there are, but also what supports you actually have in place to support them and to make sure that you're protecting them from harm as well. I think Andrew might have jumped out, but that's all right. I'll proceed how I can. With reference to workplace bullying and harassment, employees often find it difficult to collate evidence to make a case. Okay, I'm not. Oh, right, it's continued. Thereby failing to report, assuming nothing can be substantiated. Is there any case study with reference to this scenario? Look, they're very. Andrew, I think for whatever reason he has jumped out. He would probably be able to provide some examples of bullying and harassment. Not really able to comment there, except internally, I suppose, in my experience with bullying harassment, when we're looking at evidence, you know, from a more of a HR investigation point of view, it's it's really including different witnesses, I suppose, involved in the bullying and harassment. So, you know, often it's he said, she said, but, you know, when we're actually looking at different evidence like emails or, you know, other people on the sidelines who have been watching the interactions between two individuals as well, that's where an investigator might actually draw evidence from and draw statements from to make, I suppose, to provide the evidence to the person making a decision of whether or not they feel that, based on what they're looking at, bullying harassment has occurred. So Andrew, thankfully you're back. So we've got a question with reference to bullying harassment about employees finding it difficult to collate evidence to make a case, and whether or not you're aware of a case study where specifically about bullying harassment and there's been maybe an absence of evidence, how else evidence might have been collated to kind of prove.
Yeah, bullying and harassment are difficult, and it gets tied up. I'm hoping it happens less moving forward because we've now got a work health safety, like a more prescriptive work health safety duty to manage all the things that lead up to bullying harassment. So I think we can start to look behind the bullying harassment complaints and look at the things that aren't in place. So they're breaching the psychosocial reg because things aren't in place. Bullying harassment will inevitably always get caught up in you know, reasonable administrative action matters and that sort of thing as well. So I think it's important not to focus on workplace bullying and harassment and just start to, from a psychosocial perspective, say, has the business or undertaking got these things in place? But it is very difficult. So if everyone looks at that that checklist we've got, that actually works through all the issues we have around bullying, harassment, and whether it's, you know, they're under sort of reasonable management direction, and sort of works through that myriad of sort of problems that we have with them. But yeah, I do accept that it's difficult, but a lot of time it just comes down to keeping good records as well. So, and people don't think to do this. So when they start to, when people are undermined, they start to get undermined. They don't really know what's going on, and there's some of the triggers the workplace should look at. You've got an employee, suddenly they've got absences, suddenly their work suffering, and it's really easy to go both ways on bullying harassment. But yeah, it's about employees keeping good notes, and about, more importantly, employers and managers monitoring those things. So I guess as a manager myself, you try and stop people spiraling down into that sort of situation by just checking in on them. So there's another case that I actually looked at, which was a High Court case that was talking about It's a psychosocial case, and I won't bore you with all the details of it, but there was one section in there that was really interesting. The employer had come back, and had they actually inquired about this person and their well-being and how they were going, it probably wouldn't have got to where it was. And the High Court made a point of that. And the defence that they pitched was, oh, we didn't want to breach their privacy. So they went down and the court was quite scathing of that. So, it's not about that. And people can't say, oh, I didn't want to breach their privacy. If you can see someone struggling, you say, look, I can see that this is happening. Do you want to talk about it? Can I assist you? And that sort of thing. You really need to do it.
Yeah. And I suppose on the employee end, there is that perception of, is this bullying or is it performance management as well? So that would also then require the employer to show whether or not it was unreasonable behaviour by somebody, or whether it was reasonable management action. And really it's about gathering evidence through an investigator to then put the case forward of, this is what has happened, for a decision maker to determine whether or not it was bullying, harassment, or whether it was reasonable management action. Is kind of my understanding of it.
Yeah, and I've been to trial a lot on bullying, harassment, or reasonable administrative action matters. And when you do break them down, you actually can see where a matter that it's reasonable action taken is done then poorly, and it becomes unreasonable. So it can start out as a reasonable administrative action matter, and then it turns into bullying, harassment because a person, poor interpersonal skills, or a manager's going, oh no, I want rid of them now, and they certainly do then move into that bullying, harassment space, and you can pick it. You just need to be able to look at the whole of the matter. Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you, Stephen. So a licensed investigator will be able to gather evidence through witness statements. So thank you for that. And then that brings us to Andrew. Could you give us the HCA case info for that one, please? It would be interesting to read.
I will. It's something like, I'll find it, but I'll get it to you. It's something like Covenant or something versus the Queen.
So if whoever's interested, if you want to maybe contact Andrew directly, and he'll be able to send you those case details.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that seems to be the last question, which is great. So aside from all the technical difficulties, we seem to have made the time. So I suppose lastly is just, again, a big thank you for everybody who has joined us today. Great questions again. And I want to thank you all for registering and giving us your valuable time. I hope that Andrew and I have been able to increase your understanding in the psychosocial space, and have given you not only food for thought, but some guidance around some practical application of how to manage psychosocial hazards in the workplace. Now, if you haven't already, please take 2 minutes to complete the Slido poll. So I have activated that now, so you can just go back into the poll section. As Andrew and I aren't perfect, and we are keen to know how we can better the webinar experience for everyone. So please also keep an eye on my LinkedIn page and SafeWork SA's LinkedIn page as well for details on future webinars. But again, I hope you will join us again in April. And until then, take care and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.